Good afternoon, everybody. That was quite the keynote speech, so really, I was really impressed and energized. So now we go into another fantastic panel. This is the third panel on unlocking constructive capital, building trust, transparency, and opportunity in emerging markets. And my friend and colleague, Becky Johnson, will be moderating that. And Becky joined us a couple of years now, and we've worked so closely together. She has brought energy, changed a lot of things we used to do at CIPE, and I'm very proud to count her as one of my closest friends at CIPE now. So thank you for everything, Becky. But let me still tell you about her impressive biography. Becky now serves as CIPE's Chief of Staff. As soon as she came in, she and Andrew led the process of moving CIPE into a new phase of its development. We called that CIPE 3.0. Everybody at CIPE got to know her. She interviewed almost everybody at CIPE, including all our staff in the field offices, of course, at headquarters and everywhere else, and effected quite some change. Prior to CIPE, she spent time at the Healthy Weight Commitment Foundation, the U.S. Departments of Commerce and Homeland Security, and in these roles, she saw firsthand how the private sector can make a positive impact on the communities in which they operate, and how open markets can drive measurable change to the benefit of society. She was just being trained to come to CIPE. Becky grew up in Georgia, very proudly, and attended Union University, earning a Bachelor's of Art in Political Science. While running a foundation, she earned a Master's of Arts in International Commerce and Policy from George Mason University and a certificate in globalization from the University of Oxford. Most recently, Becky worked at Kimberly-Clark Corporation as a Senior Director for Global Public Policy. All yours, Becky.
Thank you so much, Abdu, and I share your sentiments. Wonderful friend, great leader at CIPE, and I'm thrilled to work with him. I'm also equally thrilled to be up here with these distinguished experts, and I have to tell you that these chairs are much more comfortable than yours, and so we might stay up here for a while. As I mentioned, joining me are distinguished experts who will discuss how to unlock constructive capital and build trust, transparency, and opportunity in emerging markets. First, I'm joined by Kwame Owino, the CEO of the Institute of Economic Affairs in Kenya. Kwame's work has made the Institute a premier think tank for sub-Saharan Africa, serving as a trusted resource, driving evidence-based policymaking across the region on issues ranging from economic regulation, public expenditure, international trade, and other critical policy areas. Kwame is a notable economist with a unique ability to bridge the gap between policy experts and stakeholders to drive positive change that is resulting in more transparent and inclusive policymaking for the betterment of Kenya and the region. I'm also joined by Dr. Nishan Damel, who is the Executive Director of Verite Research, a leading think tank in Sri Lanka. Nishan and Verite are known for their expertise in public finance transparency. He has led groundbreaking work on budget oversight, debt documentation, and fiscal accountability. His work continues to shape data-driven public finance reform. He holds many degrees, but notably a PhD in economics from the University of Oxford, where he also served as a lecturer. But we also had him here for a time, where he earned a degree in economics from Harvard University. I am thrilled to have Henry Oporto joining me today. Henry has accomplished what many CIPE partners hope to achieve. He is credited with restoring democracy to his home country of Bolivia in 1982. Henry served in the Bolivian government and is now the executive director of Fundacion Milenio, which leads groundbreaking research on the influence of corrosive capital coming from authoritarian regimes, particularly in the mining industries, working to protect Bolivia's lithium reserves. He's a sociologist and an expert in development, democracy, and public policies. But this panel would not be complete without Farrukh Irnazarov, who is a co-founder and country director at the Central Asian Development Institute and RANCIF Group. He has more than 15 years of experience working on economic development and investment strategies, trade and transportation, labor migration, and agribusiness, and managed projects for U.S., multilateral, and international institutions and companies. From 2014 to 2019, he was a visiting scholar at Johns Hopkins University and George Washington University. Thank you all for joining me today. I look forward to our discussion. Many of us are very familiar with notable corrosive infrastructure investments that have occurred around the world. The rise of Russia and China, their control over mining industries and critical minerals and rare earths, the takeover and control of ports by China. But it's also Venezuela seeking to purchase control of over 60% of Colombia's fertilizer market, potentially exposing the country to control from Venezuela. This panel will discuss the challenges, what has gone wrong with large-scale infrastructure financing, and why, and will hopefully be able to discuss where these experts see opportunities for constructive investments and how they should be structured for success. But first, I would like to turn to each of them to provide some brief introductory remarks related to the challenges your countries and regions have faced with large-scale infrastructure financing, while also telling us a little bit about your organizations. So Kwame, I'm going to turn to you first.
All right. Good afternoon, everybody. And thanks to CIPE for this invitation. Now, let me say my complete understanding or my expanded understanding of corrosive capital is not complete until I tell the story of Kenya. Now, this is a country, $120 billion in 2014, $120 billion in GDP per capita, a population of about 43, 44 million people. And then here comes a government investment which was sold to many African countries. I contest it, but the average idea is that many African countries lag in development and growth because of an infrastructure challenge. Be that as it may, the government of Kenya invests or takes up a new investment that is equivalent to 5% of GDP. And that spooked me. So I start to say, fine, if you're going to have one investment that is worth 5% of GDP, all in 1 year or in a couple of years, what are the details? And I searched, and I searched, and I searched, and we could not find them in the public domain. So that's another red flag. Now, the information that has come out through since then is it shouldn't matter. It shouldn't matter that this was with a consortium of Chinese banks, and some of them are state corporations, some of them one way or the other, but the entire loan, as I say, it was equivalent to close to 5% of Kenya's GDP for 500 kilometers of a railroad. So the funny thing that we do is we simply go back there and ask, okay, if this is what it costs, what's the equivalent in terms of benchmarking globally? And this railroad, is 3.5 times equivalent of what everybody else would construct for a similar length. Another red flag. So all I'm trying to say here is that if you did not mention names and looked at this corrosive, and had the idea about corrosive capital, this would be it. One, it's overly leveraged. Two, it's a complicated infrastructure project. Well, not necessarily complicated infrastructure project, but let me just say that it's a complicated series of agreements to bring it in. So in as much as this is one construction, there are 11 different, in the admission of the public sector in Kenya, 11 different contracts, some servicing one part of it or the other. Very, very complicated with many moving parts. That's not a good thing. Because you'd expect, what are the terms of this agreement? How much is it going to be paid for? So there's a leakage out and out of what it means. And so what we understand so far, it's since become a white elephant, but what we understand so far is that this was a 17 years project, basically 5 years of 5 years of grace period and then 12 years to pay for the entire amount at 6 plus 2, LIBOR plus 2.5%, which brought it to 8.5% of the interest rates. And if you're spending close to $5.46 billion, that's a ton of money anyway. And the assumptions would be this would have to raise close to in my calculation, about $800 million every year to be able to pay for itself over that 12-year period. My assessment back there, remember, this is just using Excel sheets without much knowledge about anything else. So it was predictable, regardless of which country. And then when you look back and say, with this amount of clouds and absence of transparency, which kind of person would go into this? And you find invariably that the countries that partner with sub-African countries or low developing countries tend to be non-democratic. They have a history of wanting, or rather specifically pursuing, under the guise of we do not interfere in domestic politics, being covered with an inadequate disclosure, and obviously with all the liabilities borne by citizens such as myself. So that's what this idea, that's when I became completely alert to it. And then finally, what does tend to happen is regardless of what the prerogatives of the state might be to hide those contracts, what we have come to right now is when this contract was opened, it was completely unviable, and then it forces the state to diminish the economic freedom of private sector firms by forcing them to have to use that railway line for its viability. So do you see this, a cascade of, one, it starts with the information that is hidden, then over time the state starts to erode everybody's economic freedoms by forcing them to raise the viability of this, and that then becomes a question that actually ended up in Kenyan courts, and even with the courts giving judgment that these contracts are supposed to be disclosed, I think only half of them, of the entire 11 are. But all the same, Kenya has had a debt overhang and obviously a problem over the last, maybe 6 years now. I actually think it's not just a liquidity problem, it's a fiscal solvency problem in which this project, not the only one, but is part of the bigger problem over Kenya's debt. So if you put all these together, it tells you that the idea of corrosive capital, in whatever way we understand it, is very, very real. And for some countries such as Kenya, where I live, it is completely connected to the government's very fragile fiscal position today. Thanks.
Thank you, Kwame. Nishan.
Thank you, Becky. So, over the last 2 days, one of the things we've discovered as we spoke with each other, and of course, we also read each other's work, is that pretty much the same story gets played out with different specifics in different places. Politicians with incentivized out of personal gain are implementing extremely consequential public infrastructure projects that are not well planned, not well thought out for the sake of society, that over time gets the country into serious trouble that needs to be then addressed as a crisis and fixed. Sri Lanka went through a debt sustainability crisis over the last few years, and that's really what woke up people to the problem, because as long as the money keeps flowing in and it looks good, people don't think about it so much. But I want to zoom out a little, because Becky has so many detailed questions that will unpack some of the details. So I thought, let's zoom out a little. The title of our talk is about building trust and transparency and opportunity. And of course, being with CIPE, we've always had, together with increasing the role of the market and the market economics, has been increasing the power of democracy, that these two things go hand in hand. I want to say that the greatest threat to democracy is not the rise of authoritarians, but the erosion of trust in elected leaders. The greatest threat to democracy, and often we think of democracy and the counter or the opposite of democracy as authoritarianism. I think that maybe we want to think differently. The greatest threat to democracy is the erosion of trust in elected leaders. Democracy, as we all know, is defined not only by the institution of public balloting, which we call elections, it is defined also by the doctrine of public trust. That's a judicial term that we've actually incorporated into our judiciary. We've written documents to help judges understand the doctrine and use it, and these documents are now quoted in Senegal, in lots of parts of the world. What does it mean? It means that those elected to office, and this is what democracy means, that those elected to office are expected to protect and advance the public interest, the common good. And that is what they're expected to use the power that we give them to do. We had Ambassador Lisa Gable, we had Colombian ex-Vice President Marta Ramirez also talk about trust. Lisa Gable said responsible stewardship. So I think we mustn't forget that when we say we are protecting democracy, we are not just protecting the system of elections and voting. We are protecting something far more fundamental than that. That is that you can get leaders who are going to represent or protect or advance public interest, and that they can be trusted to do so. When that expectation is repeatedly and it becomes chronic after a while, chronically disappointed, electoral democracy falters and becomes unstable. And I think if we think of it that way, there's a lot we can understand about what's going on in democracy in many parts of the world. The way that corrosive capital and other corrosive influences, you get them in media as well, not just in capital, undermines democracy is not by getting rid of elections or supporting or financing authoritarians. It is more insidious than that. It is by crippling the public trust in the elements of democracy. It's crippling public trust in the functioning of elected leaders while maintaining the elements of public balloting. So you get the structure of democracy working, but not the substance. And suddenly democracy itself loses credibility, and you get real social crisis and upheaval, and you're wondering what to do. I'll move to my second sort of significant thought as I zoom out. Because if public trust is the foundation to protect of elected leaders, how do you go about doing that? I think we have worked by also understanding that transparency is to public trust in a democracy what markets are to private production in an economy. We've heard it said today and spoken about how amazing markets are, how markets have unleashed private production, how it has unleashed productivity, innovation in an amazing way. And when we talk about transparency, we also mean that it is not just about information being available, but transparency should be for public trust what markets are to an economy. Markets, I think we had to be careful that many people think markets is letting people just do whatever they want and it's sort of unrestrained freedom, but markets are a kind of technology. It's an architecture that we create and has emerged in modern societies to get self-interested people to function in a way that serves the social interest. That's an amazingly interesting technology that we build. So as an economist, this is what makes it enormously interesting. This is why Adam Smith says it is not to the benevolence of the butcher, the brewer, the baker that we look for our dinner, but to their regard to their own self-interest. But that sounds crazy. Why should we promote self-interest? We don't. But through the technology and architecture of markets, we have learned how to tap self-interest to serve the social interests. And transparency, I want to suggest, or in the way that I'm talking about, the way that Verite Research does it in Sri Lanka, so I'm from a think tank, and we don't think of transparency as just data, but it is the architecture that we build, the platforms that we build, and the kind of analysis and understanding that we create through transparency is to get untrustworthy politicians to uphold and serve the public interest and to function as somehow stewards of public trust. And that is let's not think of transparency as just expansion, the availability of information. Let's think of it as an architecture that we create. And I think we have so much knowledge to share on that, to actually do in government what markets do in the private sector. So as I said, competitive markets don't exist in the state of nature. You don't see animals sort of having markets. It's a genuinely ingenious human invention that's put in place carefully and nurtured by government to allow private production to thrive, just like that. I think transparency is not just about governments giving you information and making it available. And the architecture of transparency has to be constructed and created and nurtured by social institutions to make politics work in the public interest. And so this is a symbiotic relationship, right? That while governments must maintain and act in a way that makes the market work in the social interest, society must put together an architecture of transparency or social institutions that make politics work to serve the public interest and public trust. I think I feel sad that the Oxford Dictionary, I think, got it wrong when they coined this term, post-truth society. I haven't met anyone who said, I don't care about the truth. Have you? I think it's an incorrect diagnosis. We don't live in a post-truth society. We live in a post-trust society. The crisis of our times is the loss of trust amongst social institutions and with our politics and with our political leaders. And if we can't build that back, democracy is in trouble. And the task at hand, and everything is in trouble, right? So the task at hand and the corrosive influences that we will talk about, that Kwame talked about, their real danger is not that they're undermining elections and shoring up authoritarians and dictators, that they are undermining the fabric and architecture of trust. And I see that as our mission. To build it back and restore public trust in the service of public interest in government through what we do in social institutions. So I think we are going to go into details about what we do, how we do it later on. Let me stop there by just setting the framework for how we think about what we are doing. Thank you.
Thank you, Nishan. And Kwame, you brought up transparency, you've brought up trust. Henry, you have a unique perspective from Bolivia. We'd love to hear from you.
Hermosas reflexiones las que acabamos de escuchar sobre la importancia de la
I want
confianza.
to talk about the importance of trust. I subscribe to that totally. Thank you for facilitating this presentation. I want to share with you in this first intervention, especially a sentiment. Many Bolivians are going through a moment of expectations, of high expectations. Well, we are living in a more hopeful time. It has to do not just with yesterday, the national Bolivian team won to the team from Brazil. Although that's more, that opens up the possibility of coming here for the World Cup. Pero no sé, the winds of change have arrived, fortunately, to Bolivia after 20 years of a long period of autocratic regime, communist. Fundamentally, the country is now living a transition. And what we hope, the Bolivians hope during this transition, is that it consolidates itself and that we arrive with renewed democratic regime that opens up opportunities for economic freedom, political pluralism, for further strengthening of the private sector, and for a state of law that is constituted, which are factors that we were lacking for decades. I want to insist on this point. We are at the beginning of a cycle where where there is a tiring, a wearing out of the economic system that gave to the state a central role in the economy. And that had the effect that the private sector was delegated to the sidelines. This model, this economic model, also could be described as state capitalism or authoritarian capitalism. For a few years, was popular, and it coincided with a moment of high prices that affected many countries with a lot of mineral resources like Bolivia. But for about 10 years, that economic cycle that was favorable changed. And since then, the Bolivian economy has fallen into, has stopped growing to the point where the last 2 years, Bolivia has an economic crisis and social that is more and more, becomes deeper, more profound. And this has political consequences. The most important is that we just had an election, parliamentarian and presidential, on 17th of August, with results that were waited on for the Bolivians, but was still kind of a surprise in the international community. And that is the party called Movement Towards Socialism, which was led by the strongman Evo Morales, which was hegemonic for about 2 decades, has suffered a crushing defeat. Only one delegate from his party was selected from the party for the next parliamentary. That tells you the kind of defeat they suffered. And that's a result of the crisis that is the country suffering. But on top of that, there is a strong division that has occurred in the government party that's practically dismembered the forces of that party. The truth is that favors a political change. Two candidates that were the top two candidates by popular vote in these elections will go on a second round in October to define who will be the next president of Bolivia. The good news is that both candidates that will be there in October have promises for opening of the markets, promotion of private investments, and offers a return to the institutionality of democracy and the rule of law. That gives us the hope that way the country will have more opportunities for investments. Bolivia suffers from a chronic shortage in private investments, but on top of that, it will be an opportunity, very important one, to channel constructive capital, which is one of the great challenges that Bolivia has, and that in fact has motivated a lot of the work that our organization, the Milenio Foundation, has been developing for the last 5 years with the help of CIPE in Bolivia, and which has been translated into a lot of help, and which has created conditions which are appropriate so that Bolivia can be an attractive destination for investment, and also a country that offers
so that they can offer opportunities for constructive capital. It's the economic and political challenge that we hope that the next government will be able to channel in that way. And in that way, we are in a very different situation from the previous 20 years.
Thank you, Henry. That coordination between the public sector So thank you for introducing us to that and what's going on in Bolivia. Farrukh, let's turn to you.
Thank you, Becky. Before I start, I would like to, first of all, validate what you just said. These chairs are indeed much more comfortable, but with one reservation. Because with these blinding lights, you all look like saints that are actually going deep down into New Testament in your hands. So it's actually a very interesting thing, and I wish I was a painter to actually, an artist to were able to depict that properly. Since Henry talked about football, I should also talk about football, because for the first time in history, Uzbekistan qualified to the World Cup, and it's going to be here in the States. So we are totally excited. Thank you for that. Thank you. That was a big moment where private sector looked at public sector, and public sector looked at private sector and realized they have no differences. So, we actually would like to build upon that. If our team would be able actually to progress, I think we would be able to attract more investment and hopefully constructive investment. But at the same time, Central Asia and Uzbekistan in particular, we don't have a luxury of choosing from different type of investment. It's not like, you just choose whether to go to constructive way or destructive way, corrosive way, whatever. It's more like if you are into big, large scale infrastructure project, you as a government think, okay, who are there to help us? First, you talk to multilaterals, and trust is there. So basically, when you talk to World Bank, Asian Development Bank, those guys, they already developed trust between the government and these institutions. If it doesn't work with them, you say, okay, let's try our East Asian partners, South Korea and Japan. So these guys are also quite accommodating usually. If it doesn't work there, you think, okay, we can of course try European and US, but it's going to be little lax, so why we should bother, right? And the last but not least, there are always these two good Samaritans, Russia and China, that are around to actually help you and arrange those things for you. And supply side is actually much higher than demand side in terms of infrastructure in Central Asia, surprisingly. Because China is always there, and they're offering their services, and the governments try not to be too much dependent on China, listening, looking into different experience from around the world. And also Tajikistan, that notoriously lost a piece of their land as part of this hidden debt to China. And Russians are there. They cannot, of course, match the investment from the Chinese side, especially in current circumstances. But they would always be there and make sure that we do not become friends with their friends China. So it's basically a very complicated relationship that comes into play, but it clearly shows you the pattern that Central Asians in general and Uzbeks, they're into infrastructure projects, more into public-private partnerships, and also where the governments would like to be in the driving seat. They would like to make sure that they're the ones actually who tell what to do, how to do, and play on their terms. And here, I know I sound like a broken record, but I can't just, it's there. So basically, we're surrounded by these sanction states. Just if you look in the north, it's Russia, Belarus, China, Iran, Syria, Iraq is nearby, North Korea, like I said, Venezuela, Cuba, and we have a fantastic party there. So, and it is what it is. So in this type of circumstances, you look actually what is really doable, what is really feasible in terms of infrastructure development, and you can't say no. You just operate wearing this multi-vector policy and trying to have this investment, but without being too much dependent. So you see, It's not about like, analyzing or screening in terms of corrosiveness, but it's more like not being dependent. So this is the kind of the key message that is driven by the governments of Central Asia and Uzbekistan in particular. And I would like to finish here because I see Becky is getting impatient with other questions. Thank you.
I have so many questions. But thank you, Farrukh, and certainly you're in a very difficult neighborhood. But really, some consistent themes across all four of you. Transparency, trust, a strong private sector, looking at the availability of investments that are out there and trying to sort of balance, how much you're going to have to give up in order to be able to make an infrastructure investment. Really, really compelling. Shifting a little bit, China controls 78 of the 231 ports in Africa. Many are available for dual use, which is military and commercial. And China notably took over a major port in Sri Lanka and brought large debt to the country. Nishan and Kwame, you have both worked extensively on public finance and budget transparency. Sometimes large-scale infrastructure financing comes with hidden debt and opaque requirements. What mechanisms do you see need to be in place to better assess and manage financial liabilities when countries take on large infrastructure investments? Nishan, let's go to you first.
Thank you so much. So we've had this play out in many ways, right? So some of Sri Lanka's kind of not so well done infrastructure projects range from coal power plants to airports to shipping ports. And one feature, if I jump straight to the kind of recommendation side of it rather than the problem side of it or how it happens, one of the features that are critical in trying to prevent this kind of outcome, we say is to have a public investment plan with a prioritized listing of what public investment the country needs. So the reasons most of these have been possible is because the country didn't have a public investment plan, and certainly not one that was prioritized in any way. So you could get what you call unsolicited proposals. Some third party comes and says, hey, we'd like to build this road for you. We'd like to build this airport for you. And the country says, oh, okay, right. And then, of course, perverts its own systems to do it. So what Sri Lanka did was really unprecedented. Even though we were taking it 100% debt and paying for all of it, we approved these projects under a law that was designed to do public-private partnerships. So we tweaked the public-private partnership law because when it's a public-private partnership, the law is designed on the basis that the private sector takes a lot of equity and risk. And therefore, the protections are done differently. So not only did we adjust the protections under it, but we kind of shifted what was effectively public investment into evaluated under a very different legal framework, and then set extremely lax criteria and basically allowed other people's interests to determine what got done in Sri Lanka, which was not in the public interest. So one of the things we have done, so sometimes a crisis does allow you to educate people better or get people to change better. I often ask this question, who did the technology who was most responsible for technology transformation in today's world? Was it, CEOs of Wall Street and the big tech companies? Was it the CTOs or the technology gurus and managers in sort of government planners and others who kind of designed it? Or was it COVID-19? Right. COVID-19 did an enormous amount to get us technologically savvy and functioning. Just like that, the debt crisis did a great deal in Sri Lanka to educate people on the economy, right? Get them to understand what was going on. And what we did was, when the IMF came in, we convinced the IMF that Sri Lanka you're not going to just do another macroeconomic fix. That governance is the foundation of a good economy. And if you don't fix governance, it's like building a house upon the sand. We have many biblical references today, and that's one of them. That in a little while it comes falling down, and Sri Lanka is in its 17th IMF program, right? Because you keep building that IMF program on the sand, and it keeps coming down. So, of course, with a little help from a lot of people in this country as well, we managed to persuade the IMF to do the first ever governance diagnostic in Asia, and then knowing the IMF well enough, we thought, let's not leave it to the IMF. Let's us get together as think tanks and civil society organizations. We brought over 300 together and said, we'll do a governance diagnostic of our own and do it before the IMF does it. So 80% of the IMF governance diagnostic got written by us then, which is really good. And one of the things we said is, look, the procurement law needs to change, public investment plan, prioritized. Now all of those things are as consequentially in the IMF program. And it's very unfortunate that governments in our parts of the world tend to be more accountable to the World Bank and the IMF than they are to the people of the country. And this is a feature that we all experience. But rather than mourn that fact, we used it, right? And we got it in the IMF program, and we had to keep persuading the IMF to take this seriously. Not to forget about it after putting it in, and leverage that power. So I think the procurement law, the public investment plan, the prioritization can really help break this problem of unsolicited proposals. 91% of Chinese money came in through this special mechanism, we called it, that they created. But our writing and our talking about it had such a big influence that now it's been removed. And the IMF also has asked it to be removed. And before that, also, the government got so embarrassed. So, I'll end by saying this. There's a great deal of sanitization that takes place when you shed light on something. Light is a great, sanitizer. And we use it very effectively. Part of the transparency architecture we do is we just get people animated about a problem by discovering it and shedding light on it and talking about its consequences. And you also say democracy is government by conversation. When the conversation changes, it's hard for politicians not to be responsive for it. As long as you have elections, at least, there is that thing that the national conversation creates some level of need to respond, right? Even the most authoritarian leaders depend on some legitimacy. People must accept them in some way. And the requirement to be accepted actually helps when you can drive and change the public conversation on the basis of crazy stuff you've discovered. If they could do it in hiding and in secret and in the dark and keep it there, it'll continue to happen. When we find it, expose it, shed light on it, and make it a part of the conversation in society, it's very hard to keep going. So I'm not going to give you a full-blown explanation, but just to say this is the kind of technology of transparency that we do, or some part of it. But in Sri Lanka, it is very clear that infrastructure projects were not done for the interest of the public, like you said. They were done for the patronage benefits, for the kickbacks, and for the interests of foreign companies and local politicians. But we are at the cusp of putting a stop to that right now.
That's wonderful. It makes me think of what you were talking about before, kind of that trust building and how people need accurate and reliable information, and bringing this to light helps them get that information. And several years ago, worked with another NGO, and they talked a lot about how progress moves at the speed of trust. Yes. And I think you've seen that in Sri Lanka, certainly. Kwame.
Yeah. Okay. So I think so. Let me go back in my first opportunity to speak here, what I did was define the problem. And I think one of the things we need to develop as we go forward is the ability to smell bad deals. Because, and let's be honest, I think some people in the public sector in Kenya actually believe this was a good investment. I usually find it difficult to impugn anybody's motives because I can't read their minds. But sometimes the data tells you. So let me tell you, in the year 2016, I'll plug myself here. I wrote a blog post. I used to write a weekly blog post for Kenya's leading newspaper. And I wrote a blog post in which, looking at the numbers as they were presented, I challenged anybody who thought that the standard gauge railway funded by China, a consortium of Chinese companies, would pay for themselves to actually take a wager on 1 year of my wages. Nobody did. I don't know if they were not impressed with the sum, but the point I'm trying to make is sometimes we have to stick our necks out. And let me tell you why. In Kenya's case, the absence of transparency. So for instance, they were making very aggressive claims for what will come. So for instance, they said, one, this railway line alone, 500 kilometers in a country that is 580,000 kilometers square, 500 kilometers of railway line would be responsible for 1/4 of GDP growth per year. Impossible. Impossible. So I think the idea about just fact-checking and placing information in the public domain, and sometimes making those ridiculous claims be as ridiculous as they sound, is useful for getting public opinion to be moved. The reason that is essential to win public opinion, or at least some people who make political commentaries, is I come from a continent, I don't know whether it's the same for you people, let me just speak for East Africa and Kenya. There's a very potent power that politicians get from building big, shiny projects. Mm-hmm. There is. I mean, it's unquestionable. And that is one of the things, I don't know whether corrosive capital builders necessarily flatter them by actually building on that vanity of political leaders. So as people who sit in think tanks and academics, our work is actually to prick those bubbles before they get too big. Because otherwise what you have is 14 years later sitting here, 12 years later sitting here as we are, in which those payments have to be made anyway. Mm-hmm. And the dominant part, so I'll tell you that today, for every $100 worth of public revenues, right? $61 on last week's calculation, $61 is used to pay public debt. Hmm. And that was predictable 10 years ago. So basically, I mean, maybe we are too late, but the point is we need to learn the tactics of even aggressive communication to tell people, look, this is going to be wrong. And so that's fine. And as I conclude, one of the things is sunlight is definitely, and anytime people claim for domestic policy reasons, foreign policy, because in Kenya's case, the Constitution specifically provides under Article 34, the rights, the freedom to access information, that government has access to, or rather, on public initiatives. And what the government of Kenya then was citing was that, look, in our agreement with our counterparts from China, we committed not to provide that. In other words, trading off Kenya's constitutional protections through a private corrosive capital arrangement. So that's basically it. So I don't know that there's a easy things, but anytime people are reluctant. So for instance, when somebody makes a claim that one project is going to be responsible for 25% of GDP growth per year, that's a claim that requires serious investigation. That's one. The second is the feasibility study itself was so conflict-ridden because it was done by the same firm that was going to construct the railway line. So there are just certain things that if you look, the common sense approach in my view, I do not abandon my common sense to speak big language. Just ask yourself, if this thing is such a beautiful gift from heaven, why is it hidden? Even the Bible is written so everybody has access to the literacy. Why is it so hidden? So often when stuff is being hidden, it does. And then the final one is, I assume good faith. Responsible public infrastructure is not easy to achieve, but I think it's a necessary thing for us to at all times be vigilant. And in my view, every time big infrastructure projects are opposed, I usually think about two things. One, how do we make them smaller? And two, why don't we make it subject to competition? Because competition also do. So once one has been sacrificed, sometimes it's very big, there's no competition to allow for it, and who bears the risk? If all the risk is borne by the taxpayers, it's going to go wrong. Invariably, it is going to go wrong. And that's Kenya's experience here. So anytime we are trading away transparency and the responsibility for somebody to take responsibility for the claims they're making about the contribution to growth. And there's a lot of that on the African continent. Everybody seems to say as a cliche that Africa's growth problem is a problem of infrastructure. 14 years after the biggest infrastructure project in Kenya's 60-year history, I disagree. Completely disagree with that, sir. So please don't, when there's too much hype, I mean hyperbole, please just go back there and say, there's something about this that is too much PR, and the content isn't in there. So that's it.
Becky, can I come in briefly on Kwame? So Kwame said 61% of revenue goes to pay back capital and interest on the loans. Kwame, we've beaten you on this one, really bad, however. 66% or 66 cents to every dollar of revenue in Sri Lanka goes to pay just the interest, not the capital, on the loans. It was 80 2 years ago. It is the highest in the world. It will remain the highest in the world for the foreseeable future. Even highly distressed countries like Ghana, Pakistan, it's in the 40s. So you can imagine the scale of, poor thinking and mismanagement that has gone into Sri Lanka when you understand, how bad this kind of public, because the problem, of course, is people ignore future consequences, right? It's very easy, this sense of instant gratification. So you have to kind of make the future come to the present. And as Kwame said, hiding information is a classic way to do it. We managed to push through a right to information law. So we made progress, I must say, in about 10 years ago. But then that's not enough, because in that right to information law, there is a proactive disclosure component on public infrastructure, which is really important. With CIPE, we started measuring the level of compliance on proactive disclosure. In 2024, it was 36%. And on the critical stuff that can be subject to corruption, it's 20% or under. But actually, this measuring works because in 2022, it was 18%. In 2023, it's 25%. In 2024, it's 36%. Every time we talk about it, more and more institutions find they can't hide, or there's pressure to come out. Now, this is slow progress, but that's the benefit of this thing, right? So you get the law in, and then you kind of keep an eye on compliance and start talking. We actually measure every single government institution now, not just on public infrastructure, but on all proactive disclosure requirements. Our method is now used by the World Bank globally. And what's fantastic and interesting, there's another technology we use in transparency. We create rankings. So some guys are first, some guys are last. So this creates a sense where the public sector doesn't get upset about it, because the guys who are doing well, they say, well done, keep doing, because we look good, right? But then everybody is now competing to do better. The Prime Minister's office calls, the President's office calls, says, hey, how can the Prime Minister's office is very upset, the President's office is better than them. So they want to know the tricks and tips of what they can do to go up the ranking. So we create a whole kind of competitive framework for public sector to be more transparent, and they do it. Right. So it's about the third time we've done this report, and what we find is the biggest supporter is different media ministry, different actions of government, because they like because there are now winners and losers in this thing, right? And you kind of leverage the support of the winners, and we tell those stories as well, who's doing the best, and we look at translation. So really, I think we have to take this kind of design approach to this thing, right? So how do you design this structure of transparency and make it, give it traction and make it work? Go back to you.
Yeah, I think it's identifying what incentives are going to help drive that change. And
that's right. Yeah.
Certainly nobody wants to be in a competition between your 61 and 66%. Nobody's interested in that. But competing around who can drive more compliance and greater transparency, I think is a really great way to do that. Shifting to Henry and Farrukh, both of your careers have been marked by successfully championing democratic values. How do you advocate for reforms within your own governments, such as strengthening the rule of law in a way that drives real results without sounding overly abstract or lofty or idealistic? Henry, you've successfully advocated for reforms both inside and outside the government. So let's go to you first.
Gracias por la
Thank you so much for the question. I have the opportunity to have a reflection here, to reflect on something. The corrosive capital feels as a threat in many regions of the world, particularly in Latin America, but the impact that it has is different according to the conditions in the institutions of each country. So, systematically, we can say that, for example, in Latin America, there are countries with these institutions that are stronger, relatively speaking. For example, Chile, Uruguay, Colombia, Brazil, and other countries, where you can see that resist a lot more to the influence and the penetration of corrosive capital. And they have rule of laws that are more consolidated. But there are other countries with a weaker institutions and with lack of rule of law, for example, Bolivia. And these differences in institutions or strength and the strength of the state is also reflected in the way capitals flow to the region, especially corrosive capitals. In the particular case of Bolivia, there has been a predominant penetration of corrosive capital through public infrastructure. The Bolivian state in the recent 20 years have attributed contracts to Chinese companies because there was an appreciation of part of this public expenditure that was coming from Chinese banks. And that has translated in very dark contracts, not transparent at all, not legal in many senses, and with a lot of deficiencies in the requirements for the infrastructure that was being developed. And they were not directed to the interest for the interest of the Bolivian population. And these loans that we took from the Chinese banks were not cheap. The study that we have conducted over these contracts show that the interests that Bolivia has paid for these loans have been even more higher than in average to the interests that Bolivia has paid from other governments, and of course the international financing as well, and in comparison to the international financing as well. So it has been mainly through the adjudication of public work and infrastructure, and this is how the corrosive capital has penetrated in a country like Bolivia, because we also had gaps in governance, and it has been eroding the conditions. And on the contrary, in countries with a more developed institutional background, we can see that the flow of investment, even from China, has been conducted as direct investment. And that, of course, has been, and it's more, but for sure, more beneficial for those economies. So this presents a very important challenge, and that is in countries like Bolivia, where the level of institutions is at risk, the corrosive capital threat is higher if we cannot make institutions stronger, and we cannot guarantee the rule of law, and we cannot implement transparency in the execution of public work. And if we cannot conduct better quality investments into the country, that's not going to be resulting in constructive capital. So this is the the dilemma that we have and the problem that we're facing. So the question that you have is if a country with a small economy like Bolivia can generate or can develop opportunities to attract foreign investment, direct foreign investment, to build a constructive capital. I say yes. We can generate those opportunities. In fact, the Bolivian economy, as other economies in the region, has many opportunities in the international market. Bolivia can produce food, minerals, including lithium and other rich minerals, conventional energy, renewable and green energy, some kind of digital services, and of course, tourism. Of course, we have many industries where we can increase productivity. And even in a small economy like Bolivian economy, we can reach to the international markets if we have the national and foreign investment to modernize the productive system and raise the level of production. And that way we can also be more competitive. So we have this challenge in front of us. And of course, this is not going to happen if we don't strengthen the rule of law. We do not rebuild the democratic institutions. This is the opportunity that we see in the political change. Let's see if this is the space in which Bolivia can heal these institutional cracks, legal issues, rule of law. But of course, it also has an effect on the natural capital flow that reaches to our country.
Of course. You know, the need for strong institutions to drive change related to rule of law is not unique to Bolivia. It's certainly one that I think many of our partners face around the world. But then I also appreciated your reference to a role that the private sector can play and really modernizing production that will help encourage that constructive capital. But Farrukh, let's turn to you.
Thank you. I'll try to be short because I see that now Felix is getting impatient with his Q&A sessions. Basically, if I'm not mistaken, it was former Peruvian President Benavides who said that for my friends, everything, and for my enemies, the law. Yeah. So basically, this is something that leads to emergence of oligarchic structures. And we see it around the world. So that's why when we see, like, you see even the connotation of law might be different. It really depends like what context we are using it and how we are using it. And in order to be successful, we often have to be pragmatic. We have to distinguish between, first of all, we have to acknowledge, accept the fact that we cannot change the situation overnight. All of a sudden, all those institutions will not become strong and the rule of law will prevail. We should be not that naive. So in that sense, if we're able to distinguish between three categories of institutions, the first ones, you realize that the government is quite resistant to change at this time. So it doesn't make much sense to get into that because you will see lots of resistance, maybe not open resistance, but it's going to be there. So it will be like, beating the dead horse. So what's the point? The second one is where the government is interested but lacks capacity. So this is something like a low-hanging fruit where you can jump in and try to work with the government and develop trust. Because once they realize that we are basically following the same principles and you have the same guiding star to follow, the government will be much more receptive and much more accommodating to follow particular initiatives. In that sense, every single bit matters. So sometimes we say that basically it's a waste of time, it's a waste of resources. Actually, it's not, because you realize in the long run, it pays off. And the third category, when you realize that this is something that unfortunately many international organizations fail to understand. They look at the key strategies of the government, like let's say digital strategy 2030, or like agribusiness strategy 2035. And they use it as a Bible. They believe that the government is so much committed into that, so if they structure their policies, if their initiatives and activities around that, then the government would be very much happy to work with them. And to their disenchantment, they realize that it's not often the case. So they come, they have a beautiful talk with the public sector representatives, and then after some time, whenever they launch initiatives, because it also takes lots of coordination for them, they get disappointed because the government is actually less committed than these organizations are. So this is more like something like a wishful thinking for the government where they would like to be in that time period. But it's not necessarily like a Bible where they strictly follow what's written. And once you understand the context, it's actually much easier to promote at the grassroots level a number of initiatives to strengthen rule of law, democracy principles, and associated factors. I would stop here, and Felix.
No, that's wonderful. I've found in building kind of those public-private partnerships, you're never going to find someone that you agree with 100% of the time. I don't have family members I agree with 100% of the time, or friends. But it's figuring out what is that 60, 70% where you do agree, where you can work together around common goals and objectives and drive change where it really needs to happen. And I think that's really important. But obviously that comes with trust. Now, I have many more questions that I can ask these gentlemen, but I want to turn to you. So who has a question in our audience? Wait, we'll go to Abdu, who has shouted out loud if he can ask a question.
But the Zoom audience won't hear.
Yes.
I've been restrained not to ask questions as I have too much FaceTime already. But I'm intrigued by this panel in particular. For Kwame and Nishan in particular, you talked about 61%. And 66%. You knew
Interest
this was going to catch us, right? 66, and it's interest only,
Yes.
right? So that's an even different playing field here. My question to you too, and then I have one for all of you, is: are these collateralized loans? So if you fail, then they take something back from the country, or are they development loans mostly? If you give us some more information about it, that makes a huge difference. And for all of you, can I hear more about some concrete things we can do together to fix the issue? You've talked generally in low-hanging fruit and things, but can you give us more concrete examples of what can be done to address it? It doesn't have to be short-term, it could be long-term, we can be patient, but what can we do together?
Yes.
Yeah.
Henry.
Me gustaría hacer referencia a lo siguiente. Hemos hablado de la necesidad de reformas institucionales, reformas legales que puedan favorecer el clima de inversiones, eso es fundamental, pero no lo es todo. También es indispensable trabajar para crear ambientes sociales más amigables con la inversión extranjera, principalmente, y con el capital constructivo. ¿Qué quiero decir con esto? Que países como el caso de Bolivia se caracterizan porque sectores amplios de la población tienen una cultura tradicional refractaria, de mucho recelo, desconfianza.
Distrust before the foreign investment, the one that perceives sometimes as a selfish investment, an investment that wants to be predator of the natural resources. They also talk about stealing the natural resources of the country. So it's not, there is a social environment of distrust, and that culture always rejects the foreign investment, and it exists, and we have to face that. So a way in which we found in the Milenio Foundation in Bolivia to work on this issue is to work on what we call a constructive capital index. It's a qualification that foreign companies that operate in Bolivia obtain in different fields, and we designed a methodology that has three simple criteria. The first one is transparency, the second one is social responsibility and environmental responsibility, and the third one is the impact. And the variables have been implemented, and this year we made the first publication of the report. And it contains 21, it has 21 companies that participate in these reports. And we provide the information to these companies in which are the areas of opportunity to improve from the point of view that we analyze, and they can look at that mirror and identify some items so that they can improve their work in our country, and that way is beneficial for them. But the second aspect of the report is to provide information that is objective, that is unbiased about the performance of these companies to the Bolivian population. These indicators, and in a very unbiased way, we can show the Bolivian population that there are companies that are developing their performance complying with the standards. There are the ones that our population is claiming at the same time. They are conducting their work with integrity, with transparency, and they are contributing to the economy of the country. They are innovating and they have values, and this is why we need to encourage the presence and the development of companies from foreign investment in Bolivia. So yesterday, actually, I was telling about my experience in the roundtable, and this constructive capital index, being that the name or other, we could actually apply it to the whole South American region so that we can replicate it, and it shows us also comparisons between the countries. This is a concrete idea, and it might be an experience that might be fruitful for everybody.
And his group has done with their ranking system. So thank you for that.
I will maybe reply Abdul very briefly.
Yes.
Abdul, there's a very large range of stuff you can do, but if I put them in buckets, there are carrots, there are sticks, and there are straitjackets. Right? The straitjackets are the laws that you like, the procurement law. We've got that in the new IMF program. Even taking away public acceptance of these things or public praise, that becomes a straitjacket. It just reduces the space legally, politically. The sticks are really the ability sometimes to even prosecute. So we've trained judges, I mean, it's come out of certain court cases, to apply the doctrine of public trust. And my goodness, it's really changed the ability to prosecute things that are not strictly illegal, but obviously in bad faith. And we recently managed, actually we advised that the lawyers and worked with them to prosecute on irrational decision making. So we extended the doctrine of public trust to that the public officers or politicians must act with, the part of public trust is rationality. So if all the information that says don't do this is put in front of them, they can't go and do it and say, oh, we thought it'll work. Right? They must act on evidence that they have and be able to show it. So we got the central bank to release like thousands and thousands of documents, hunted them down, now we're putting it in a library, and demonstrated that the information that they required, that they acted against the best advice or the preponderance of advice that was available to them. And there's a case now that has held the past presidents, central bank governor, everybody as have violating the fundamental rights of the people because of this case. Now, these act as real blockers, right? Because people don't want to retire and have their reputations destroyed. So it acts as pushback. But then Becky was going to ask me a question which speaks to the carrots. One of the reasons to do this is, as Kwame said, people want to, it's really grand politically to build infrastructure, roads, ports, and say, look what I've done, these beautiful things. And the problem with working with multilateral institutions often is they'll want a feasibility study that takes a month of Sundays. Then they'll want to look at environmental impact assessment that takes 3 months of Sundays, and so on and so forth. The political cycle, this does not work in the political cycle. So you go to somebody else, they're willing to give you the money tomorrow and worry about the feasibility studies day after tomorrow. Literally, 3 years after the project got started, there are feasibility studies that are approved, etc. But I think you've got to address that by saying, let's get the fees, let's parallel track this. Let's look at the country's procurement priorities. Let's put the feasibility studies in advance. So that you don't have to wait till you start thinking about it to do the studies. So it's very easy to kind of create a pipeline where everything is ready to go. And yes, at the beginning it'll take a little time, but once you get that pipeline going, the environmental impact assessments are done, the feasibilities are done. And that's what happened after the war. Really, in the 1990s, I was working for the president's economic advisor, and we set up this office and we did all this crazy stuff of research, studies, all that. But there was a war going on, nothing could be implemented. But the war ended and everything was ready. And suddenly you could unroll these things one by one very fast. But then they ran out of those ideas, and then it was silly season, right? Like anything could be done all of a sudden. So really, it makes a massive difference that thought and energy goes in advance to do these things. And there's a lot of leverage that these organizations have, because when they give money, they can ask for certain modifications of laws and regulations. For instance, ADB said, look, the involuntary resettlement. Sri Lanka can just throw people out of their houses to build a road and not give them any money and treat them really badly under the law. But ADB said that's not okay. You need a new law on involuntary resettlement. And it's first a policy, and that is made into a law. But then they kind of backtracked. As long as ADB projects follow the policy, it's okay that you don't have the law. It was so I think sometimes staying the course, because they have so much leverage, because they're bringing in money, they can actually improve the structures that the country has, and once it's in law, then it acts to kind of act more positively than corrosively. So I think it's just about focusing. So it is a real problem that that development projects don't work in political cycles, but it's a fixable problem, right? And we must focus our mind onto that and say we will address that and make it possible. Private-public partnerships work when the private sector puts in a lot of energy and does it. But when you have corrupt government or incompetent government, these partnerships, as Joe Stiglitz says, are great partnerships. The private sector takes all the profit and the government takes all the risk. So they can go bad also. They're not an automatic solution. And in Sri Lanka, what's happened is corrupt private-public partnerships have brought private sector a bad name. So we don't help the private sector this way. Because now it's politically popular to say, I will not let the private sector do these things, because everybody associates private sector with corruption. So if you let that run for the sake of speed or just saying anything with the private sector is good, what you'll do is ultimately create a massive social block for the acceptance of private enterprise and private sector, because crony capitalism, the private market and private sector is associated with cronyism. And that does nobody any favors, right? And I think the private sector should be interested in making sure these corrupt deals don't happen, because it's very short-sighted, because you lose the ability to succeed as private sector in the long term. I'll stop quickly.
Yes.
Okay, I'll say, I know we are short of time, so I'll say 3 things, not perhaps neatly packed. But the first is, one of the things we're working on in Kenya is to ensure that any foreign currency denominated loan for infrastructure or whatever, for whatever purpose, we require an ex ante notification to the public, with at least 30 days available to the public sector, to the parliament. The reason for that is then it allows for these conversations to be heard about what the real terms are. I think that would be a really significant minimum. The second one is, I think this perhaps is not in CIPE Street. Look, if you look at sub-Saharan Africa, taking that analytically flawed concept of sub-Saharan Africa, you'll realize one thing. 1/3 of sub-Saharan African countries are facing debt distress. So there's definitely going to be defaults. There is. It's a matter of when, not if. So what that brings us to is a question of international financial architecture reform. And by thinking about that is basically part of the reason this corrosive capital gets away with it is partly because countries are scared of defaults. Because part of the contracts usually state that, look, if you default on our loan or something else, then we recall this. And you know, the big country called China is not part of the common framework. And that complicates loan restructuring, which is sometimes required as a reset to get countries out of these difficult problems. So if a reform could allow for some kind of collaborative default in which everybody accepts, well, things have gone wrong, we need to do that, perhaps that would help as well, because it shifts incentives both sides. For somebody not to force feed a country that cannot take loans, too much of it, caring that if that happens and an administration changes, then you might actually lose your shot. So that's one thing again, something like sticks. And then the final one that I think we all should bear mind to is, in June 2024, Kenya was in the news for 3 weeks, for bad reasons. All what we call generational protests. And generational protests in Kenya were driven by the fact that, as I said, if government is paying 61% of all revenues to debt servicing, it needs new income and therefore tried to raise by 2 percentage points of GDP in 1 year, new taxes, and that led to those generational protests. I think there's a connection between, and we should examine this specifically, but I think there's a connection between corrosive capital and when it takes over and the kind of instability that we've seen in a couple of countries for sad reasons. And the reason for that is because our first session this morning was about how businesses require predictability. And what we have now is if you're going to have this series of protests every now and again, and Kenya's had quite a number of them over the last few years based on government trying to raise taxes here and there to cover that, it might be something we can examine, because if we know that those are the consequences, then it is possible to use that to actually allow government to say, look, you're simply kicking this ball down the line and it's going to create a very unstable business environment. But more importantly, it will allow business people and business associations to be part of it and tell government, you need to be very careful about the consequences of some of these deals that you enter into. Thank you.
If I can just add a tiny piece there. You know, there's something called a DSA, a debt sustainability analysis. Mm-hmm. And you can very easily mandate that those be done on a regular basis, that any country that lends when a DSA says the debt is not sustainable gets treated in a particular way when you have to default, right? So, because otherwise these are corrosive lending at that point. Yeah.
Sure. Farrukh, I want to...
I'll be even shorter than Kwame and definitely Nishan. So two things to Abdul's question. The first one is doubling down on industry leaders. So whoever follows this good governance practice, embedded them actually to incentivize them. Because after all, Central Asia, Uzbekistan in particular, it's a copycat economy. So so you don't have to invest into other players afterwards. Because if you see that you are successful with these practices, all other players will do their utmost to actually get this on board and actually to be equipped with these practices. And that's why it's very important to capitalize on industry leaders. The second one, even though like some of my colleagues said that these rankings are not really good, but I think in Central Asia, in the absence of a better motivation, because we don't have like a motivation to join the European Union, for example, or any other things, these rankings are actually quite helpful. Yes, in a way they camouflage the real reforms, but you try to do your best actually because you are in line with the general policy where the governments would like to see their countries high in the ranking. So, and that's a perfect opportunity to say, okay, actually we can be there. So there are, for Uzbekistan, it's like 20 key indices that are pre-selected by the government, and the government closely watching it. They're inviting consultants from all over the world to help them improve their situation ranking, because after all, they realize that it correlates well with the investment attraction and better enabling environment. Thank you. I'll stop here.
Thank you. Who else has a question? We have over here.
Yes, so I'm curious to ask about the credit rating. When I look at all of the countries, Sri Lanka, Kenya, Bolivia, and Uzbekistan, a lot of you don't have a good credit rating. What do you think that you guys are doing to improve that, to get off speculative or B minus or whatever the grade you have? And when do you plan, what are your plans to get it better to where financial banks start trusting you a lot more on that level?
May I start?
Of course.
Pre-2016, we had really best ranking and the credit score because we're not actually indebted. We were not interested in taking any debts. And when the new government came to power, for that particular reason, so everyone was willing actually to lend money. And that's how we ended up actually in the situation where we have to restructure our debts and look like, for other ways to work mostly with the World Bank and to improve the situation. So basically, once it gets good, you are into that trap where you are looking actually for more investment. But I think at this stage, it's quite manageable. So it's about like, yeah. So in that sense, the situation in Uzbekistan, I think, is okay compared to many other countries worldwide. Thank you.
Anybody else on the panel want to talk about credit rating?
I think, well, credit agencies ultimately look at the likelihood of you being able to repay debt, right? So your debt sustainability is important. But governance also counts. There's a remarkable, I can show you slides and regressions, other things we've done, remarkable correlation between credit ratings and the World Bank governance indicators, like countries with better credit ratings have better governance indicators. Almost a straight line relationship between countries that will restructure again and countries that won't. You can just draw, if the governance indicators are better than a certain number, they don't restructure again. If they're worse, there's repeat restructure. So actually educate, and investors are actually quite savvy to this. So much so that, one of the innovative things we did, Abdul, in getting this in is we created what's called a governance-linked bond. So it's the first G bond in the world. You heard about ESG bonds. So this is the first G bond in the world because you realize in budgets there's a boom and bust cycle, right? Come close to an election, they bust the budget. Because, we'll worry about the problems tomorrow. This year we must win the elections. So effectively, these bonds create a commitment device. If you act in a certain way, then the country doesn't get credit relief that it would otherwise get. So we convince creditors that if the government kept certain governance KPIs, they would reduce, and we got 75 basis point reduction in the coupon payments, which is quite large. But the KPIs were designed to be governance oriented. But now everybody knows that the government must do it, and it's also a commitment device. Investors look at it, and when the government complies and meets the KPI, it gets a bump up in credit risk reduction. So creditors are also better off. They did it because they realized this is a risk-reducing instrument. And if they reduce risk, they do better. Mm-hmm. And government is saying, well, we'd like a coupon, we'd like some of that benefit back, so give us a coupon reduction. So it's a win-win. Right? It's not a zero-sum game here. Both parties can actually win. And we managed to convince creditors, the government was too scared, to put it in the Sri Lanka's debt restructuring as a new instrument that we designed. And it got through and we issued it. I think multiplying kind of innovations like that actually focus on governance as what we can fix, will be the how we unlock credit ratings as well. And some of these indicators are designed really to make sure that Sri Lanka has a plan to manage its debt. And is doing it in a responsible it's at least evaluating its debt constantly and is publishing a plan. And for creditors, they'll pay 75 basis points to avoid the extra risk.
Sure. Kwame, did you want to
Yes,
ask something?
just this. I have a completely different view from many, including in my colleagues in the office, about credit ratings. The idea is that the credit ratings agencies, most of which are based in North America, for some reason, because they're based here and they don't have domestic, they don't live within the capitals in sub-Saharan Africa, especially, and what we call the global south, whatever that word means. Therefore, rate those countries too harshly. That's an argument that's been made. It's a political economy argument. I disagree with it sitting in Kenya, for instance. The government of Kenya has had a plan, a long-term plan, in which the stated deficit numbers, fiscal deficit numbers, will be 3%. In the last 11 years, only twice has it been within that limit. So why anybody would think that anybody sitting at Fitch, or whoever else, I mean, I don't know any one of them personally, so I'm not pitching for any of them, would actually treat a government that is obviously fiscally irresponsible based on its own ratings. I mean, failing on its own yes,
laws,
yes, on its own laws is something that I find very, very interesting. There's an argument that you should have others. So yes, if there's need for more competition, they're the big four, maybe you should have others, that's fine. But the idea that if you have an African rating agency sitting in Nairobi to rate the government of Kenya well is actually something that I think is a lie. It could even be worse because they know more. Thanks.
Thank you. I have just been notified that they're about to get the hook out and drag us off stage. So just to sum up, I think you have provided us with some real tangible things that we can work together on. Common goals are so important. Access to good quality information, a strong private sector, all of these things help build trust that's needed to make good decisions. And drive countries forward to really avoid that corrosive capital investment. So thank you to each of you. Please join me in thanking our panel.
Thank you, everybody. Thank you, Becky. Wow, that was so informative. I really appreciate it. So we have now a short break. Please come back at 3:30, where we will have the last panel, but this panel wraps it all up. It's about practical tools that we need to map, identify, and track corrosive capital. How do we do it? How do we track it? Without the data, we will not be able to. So please, enjoy your coffee. Come back soon. See you.